Corey mentioned that with climate change increasing the amount of precipitation we're getting in the spring, and with the lack of fires every year for the past 50 years, trees and brush are probably one of our biggest enemies in the prairie, because when the trees and brush grow up, it shades out the native prairie below it, and it increases the amount of places for predatory birds to roost, and so you see a lot fewer bird species nesting around the trees. So a lot of our work we do, besides restoration work, is removing trees and brush. And a lot of the activities that we're doing here at Ordway are much the same as at Lake Johanna-Esker. So you can't really see it too much behind me, but a little bit over to the north of us, you can see some areas that have been mowed. And that is some of that sumac mowing that we've been doing at Lake Johanna-Esker also happening here. This was burned 3 years ago, so now that's the second year after burning that we've mowed this. We'll also be mowing some of the sumac here on these hillsides. They were mowed once last year, and they'll be mowed again this year. And then more obviously, the aspen removal. I mentioned that there's kind of 3 ways that we deal with aspen. One is girdling, and you can see behind me there's that aspen clone that's a little bit shorter. The leaves are turning yellow, a little bit smaller. That was girdled last year, and so that's another aspen clone that is going to be succumbing to starvation here probably in the next 2 years. Closer to us, you see an aspen clone that's got some brush piles around it. This is an aspen clone that we've been cutting and treating the stumps with herbicide to try and keep the resprouts down. And there's a lot of other stuff growing up. There's cherry and honeysuckle and buckthorn that we'll have to go in and spray as well. So it's a little bit quicker way to deal with the aspens, a little bit more chemical use. We'll compare the effectiveness of each of these, and we are doing more and more growing season burns. The problem is availability of crews and resources to conduct those. So when we can't do a growing season burn, mowing is also pretty good. And the benefit of mowing is that you also don't destroy all of the native vegetation, which is certainly adapted for growing season burns, but if we're trying to do it 2 years in a row, that can be kind of hard on the native species, and you also don't have a lot of the fuel buildup that you need to conduct those growing season burns if you're doing them 3 years in a row. So the idea with the mowing is to do it 2 years in a row after burning. And if you can do it after a growing season burn, that's all the better. Now we've done some growing season burn plots out here for every year or every other year for the past 10, 15 years. And it is really striking to see the difference between the areas that we burned every other year for the past 15 years and the areas outside of that. And the areas inside there's hardly any sumac. And they were areas where there was lots of sumac. So growing season burning does effectively control sumac. It's just a matter of being able to get that onto the landscape.
Within the Minnesota Prairie Plan, we of course have the different prairie core areas. Where we're currently located is the Glacial Lakes Prairie Core. And this particular region that we're in, we kind of call the Ordway Glacial Lakes Prairie Core area. It's sort of the heart of the core, where we've got some of our best prairie and some of our best complexes of different properties around here. What I wanted to do was just highlight some of the work that we've been doing towards protection of the prairie around here, and some of the quite impressive achievements that we've been able to get just through acquisition and easement protections. This map depicts what we had protected prior to the OHF grants that started back in 2008. This second map depicts the darker polygons are what has been protected since that time. So since 2008, this is how much more land in these darker green polygons that we've been able to protect within this landscape. This is pretty significant. What we see here is the pink polygons are the remnant prairie that we have, and you can see what lies outside of any of these polygons. These polygons do represent either anything that's protected, so it can either be permanent easement or under agency or NGO conservation. And so yeah, with the native prairie, the remnant prairie layer on here, that's the pink. You can see just how much more we still have to go as far as protecting our prairie out here, but we've been able to come a long ways. And this was just a final map I wanted to show of this area. These different colors on here represent the different agencies that are involved. The purple is the Fish and Wildlife units. The green are the state's DNR units, the WMAs. The blue are the TNC units, and the orange are the private land permanent easements. And you can see it's quite a mosaic of different protection types out in this landscape. This is definitely a partnership landscape, and I think this really highlights the work that we all do as agencies to work with our private landowners, to work within our neighborhoods, and to work together. A lot of these complexes, you can even see we'll have several complexes together that are comprised of different agencies. You know, we'll have units that have TNC, plus easement, plus Fish and Wildlife, plus DNR, all located together next to each other. And we'll work together. We'll work together for coordination of management, for coordination of burning, for grazing. That's very important in this kind of a landscape where we've got so many shared borders across the prairie. Depending on what the management is that we're trying to achieve, some of the obstacles that we might encounter are, for example, grazing or fire management. There's different levels of what we need to do for federal and state agencies. What we do with our fire program is that we hire fire crews every year with TNC, and we'll use our crews to not only do prescribed burns on our TNC properties, but also providing additional support to our Fish and Wildlife and our DNR partners. Our goal every season is that on any particular day, whenever there's a fire that a burn boss is trying to complete on the landscape, if we can provide enough people through our partnerships to provide folks to fill out the fire crews for anybody that's looking to burn in the landscape that day, that's our goal to achieve. And most of the time we're able to do that. It is quite a partnership between TNC, Fish and Wildlife, and DNR. We will assist each other on each other's burns. That does mean that we have to meet different qualifications for, which agencies' requirements that they have on their burn units. And then there's other project work too for if we're doing cross grazing management that requires grazing plans. That means that our grazing plans have to meet agency standards for the different units that are being grazed. And so we have to overcome those obstacles and figure out a way to make a grazing plan that will meet the needs of both agencies. Each agency does determine its own priorities, but we do have the local technical team, which is that general oversight. We meet regularly, usually once a year, and we'll talk about different priorities within the landscape, what our resource needs are going to be, what our upcoming fire plans are going to be. We don't get into the level of deciding which units are going to be prioritized over other units. That is still done at the management office level. But we do have overall communication as far as for our seed harvesting program, for example. We want to make sure that every year we've got native prairies that we are burning that we'll be able to potentially be utilizing as seed harvesting units. We don't want to be burning all of our potential seed harvesting units in one year, and then the next year we've got nothing that we can burn that we can use as a seed harvesting unit.
We do quite a bit of seed collection in our LTT here, and the reason for that is because we have very ambitious goals for prairie restorations and reconstructions. And part of the prairie plan is increasing the footprint of prairie, not only protecting the native prairie. So in places where we acquire land with some native prairie on it, it has some old farm fields on it, we will oftentimes restore those to prairie. In other areas, we might buy a farm field next to a native prairie in order to make a buffer around the native prairie, try and increase the footprint of the native prairie on the landscape. So in order to do that at scale amongst all the agencies in this LTT, we have to create a lot of, collect a lot of seed. And seed is very expensive, native prairie seed, especially when we're trying to get the high numbers of species that are really found in some of these native prairies. The prairie behind me has upwards of 200 species of native plants on it, and we try to recreate that as much as possible. And that's been something that's been increasing the last few years. So 5-10 years ago, it wouldn't have been common to find prairie restorations with less than 30 species of plants, especially the flowering plants. You might have a few warm season grasses, half a dozen or a dozen species of flowers, some of the ones that are easier to collect and easier to grow. And then over the last few years, it started to increase more to 50, 60 species of flowering plants, plus a greater assortment of grasses, more cool season grasses, to try and increase the floral diversity of the reconstructions. Now we've started doing really ultra diverse restorations with trying to get as many species as possible in there. So we're oftentimes collecting 150 to 240 different species for our restorations. And those are put into different mixes depending on the soil type. So we'll have a dry hilltop mix, we'll have a wet prairie mix, a mesic mix, dry mesic mix, and whatnot. And then some of those species are early season species that we really try and focus on getting those early species because that's often missing from restorations. So species like wood betony, prairie smoke, passflower, we collect a lot of that in the early part of the summer, and then those species we spread onto last year's restorations because the thinking is that spreading the seed soon after collecting it is better for those early season species to try and get them to germinate more effectively. Not necessarily true for every species, but that's kind of the way we've been doing it. We'll see if that works. But the whole point is that doing these ultra diverse restorations at scale requires a lot of seed. If we were to source all that seed just off of TNC preserves for our own restorations, or if Fish and Wildlife was trying to get just seed from their own WPAs for their restorations, or DNR is just trying to get seed for their WMAs, it wouldn't be enough seed to go around for all the restorations we want to do. So we've created these seed harvesting collaboratives, and in this landscape we've hired interns, and I've led the interns around the landscape every summer for the last 3-4 years collecting seed. In some other LTTs they've used more contractors or more of their own equipment, whether it be WPAs or WMAs. But we've really benefited from the collaboration with DNR and Fish and Wildlife in doing those seed collection efforts, and that's allowed us to get the diversity and the abundance of seed that we need. So I've got just a few numbers to illustrate my point. We collected seed for our seed collection program from 8 different TNC preserves in this landscape, 17 Fish and Wildlife WPAs, and 12 different DNR WMAs. And so we were able to collect a lot more sites because of that collaboration. And we use both hand collection and mechanical collection methods. So hand collecting goes on all summer. We go out into a prairie and we hand pick seeds. And that's where we get the diversity numbers because we can collect all season long. We can hand pick certain species that we're going after to try and get those species in our restoration mixes. But that's still hard to get really high abundance when you're hand picking. I think the last couple years we've averaged 200 to 300 pounds of seed via hand picking. So that's where the mechanical harvesting comes into play, and we use seed strippers, which are basically big brushes to collect seed, and we've also got a combine on loan from the DNR, and we've gone around and harvested sites that have been recently burned, which produce a lot of seed. And so that's really helped us get the amount of seed up to do more restorations at scale. So some more numbers based on that. The hand collection efforts, 79% of the seed that we collected by a hand collection was on TNC properties, but 91% of the seed that we collected via mechanical means was on DNR properties. So it was kind of this inverse relationship. So because we know the TNC properties really well, we know where the plant populations are, we can go out and handpick the seeds on the TNC properties. But then DNR had a bunch of really nice mesic prairies last year that were burned, really great seed collection sites for a combine, so we were able to do a lot of combine harvesting on DNR sites. And Fish and Wildlife kind of falls in between. Some of them are really close to us. We have a lot of good hand collection sites. Some of the WPAs have really good mechanical harvest sites as well. In the past, the idea for prairie restorations was to get ultra-local ecotype seed, collect from right next to where you're restoring. And now the idea is that, with a fragmented landscape like we are in here, gene flow between species isn't necessarily facilitated as well as it could have been in the past. And so the populations of plant species aren't as well equipped to deal with stressors like climate change and habitat loss. So we're trying to artificially bring in some gene flow by collecting from, around the landscape, from as many different sites as possible for each population of plants.
Nature Conservancy, the Minnesota DNR, and the Fish and Wildlife Service are the 3 organizations that help coordinate GMT. It's an adaptive management project, an adaptive grassland management program, which I know is a term that gets kind of thrown around a lot, and people talk about it being a really great way to do things, but I've noticed, at least in a lot of audiences, when people hear adaptive management, in their heads they hear trial and error. You try something out, you see if it worked, and then if you keep doing it or you do something else. The way that we're thinking about adaptive management is a bit more formal. Well, not a bit, a lot more formal than that. So I'll just explain the way that we have this program set up. So we've got a standardized monitoring protocol that we use, which I'll describe in a minute. And we could even show people how it works if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So we've got this standardized monitoring protocol that we do, and we then also have built predictive models. They're state in transition models that are partially informed by just expert opinion, but then also because we've been doing it for 12 years now, they're also now partially informed by our actual data that we've been collecting over the history of the project. So we've got these predictive models that basically say if your prairie is in a given state, for example, practically pristine, like this one is that we're standing on, would be one extreme. The other extreme would be it's native sod. Technically, it's still native prairie. It's never been plowed, but it's very heavily invaded by, say, smooth brome or Kentucky bluegrass. That would be the other extreme of those states. And then we've got a range of conditions in between. We've got 6 states that we classify our prairies into. And it's based on the amount of native versus invasive cover out there. The project is really focused on trying to learn about smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass and how we can best manage our prairies to keep those in check or eliminate them if that's a possibility. And so the states are defined by the amount of native cover, and then some indicator species that we've identified as being good indicators of a relatively healthy prairie ecosystem in Minnesota. And then also a little bit as well on the amount of woody vegetation on the prairie. So those 3 things kind of come into play to define our states. You do the monitoring, you get an identification of what state your prairie is in. The predictive models give us, based on that state, an idea of what the best management would be to take on that site, whether it would be to burn it or to graze it, and then also how frequently to do that active management, or to rest it. That's another one of the management options. And so the model uses then your site-specific information to give you a site-specific, unit-specific management recommendation. And then the manager, over the course of the next 3 years, it's a 3-year time step for this project, over the course of the next 3 years, they implement whatever management they want to be totally frank. We hope that they'll implement the recommended management as much as possible because that will help us learn the fastest. After the end of the 3-year management cycle, then we go back out and do the post-treatment monitoring. And then that gives a sense of where that transition, how that transition happened. Okay, so we monitor, we manage, we monitor. And that second round of monitoring does 2 things for us then. One is it helps us test those state and transition models to see how accurate they are, if some of the parameters need to be tweaked at all to make them better at predicting the outcomes that we're expecting to see. But that second round of monitoring also sets you up for the coming cycle as well. So the year 3 monitoring that you do, the second round of monitoring that you do, is both informing our models, but then also giving us now what's our current state of that prairie. And then you get a new set of management recommendations that are based both on, again, the specific state of that prairie at that point in time, which may or may not have changed, but then also based on everything that we've learned over the course of the previous 3 years, and however the model may have been updated to kind of tweak what that recommendation might be.